right, good afternoon, everyone. So I'll move us to our panel discussion on the intersections and interactions of digital literacies, corpus linguistics, and computer-assisted language learning. First of all, a couple of words about the format. We will have 3 presenters. They will each do their presentation, and then we will have then we'll move to our Q&A with the audience. So I'm going to move now to our first presenter, who is Jill Castig. She is associate professor who recently joined the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Social Cultural Studies in the College of Education here. She works collaboratively with multidisciplinary colleagues from across the university on technology-enhanced language learning. Jill is a former teacher and active researcher whose work explores digital literacies, learning, collaboration. She co-edits a column in the Journal of Adolescence and Adult Literacy, focused on digital literacies for disciplinary learning, which explores how reading, writing, communicating, and collaborating digitally can support language development, knowledge building, and STEM learning. So I'll let Jill start.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen with you so that you can see my slides. And just a second here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today and participate in this panel discussion. I'm really excited to share findings today from research about the role of self-paced, tutor-facilitated online learning that was focused on digital literacy acquisition and language learning among underserved adult Spanish speakers, a population that doesn't get a lot of attention in terms of examining their learning needs. And I wanted to specifically recognize the research group that I worked with to do this research at Portland State University with colleagues Gloria Jacobs, Andrew Pizzolatto, Elizabeth Withers, Kimberly Pendell, and Stephen Reeder. This research was supported by 2 grants from the Institute for Museum and Library Services and from the Broadband Opportunities Technology Program. So I wanted to recognize the funders as well. This work represents a broad commitment to building literacy and language pathways to social and economic justice for underserved populations. And the research was conducted in partnerships with community-based organizations and provided educational materials through a program called LearnerWeb, which is a digital learning platform designed specifically for adult learners. One of the problems that we addressed in this work is the fact that despite the growing prevalence of digital literacy in our everyday lives, there remain a significant number of adults who are not able to take advantage of online resources in order to fully participate in our digital world. This study focuses on English language learners, and especially those who are Spanish-dominant speakers. In 2010, an FCC survey reported that of the 35% of all U.S. adults who have not adopted broadband at home, 22% cite digital literacy as their primary barrier. This inequality requires an investment in training and support for these individuals. In addition to existing access-focused programs and providing those to this population, and in many ways, this is a call to action among educators to turn their attention to this underserved population. So these individuals that I'm talking about are least likely to have adopted home broadband internet. They're lower income individuals, minority groups, older adults, adults with less education, and in some cases, persons with disability. This research comes from the perspective that adult literacy learning is fundamental to society, and without digital literacy skills and digital access, adults are unable to engage in our participatory democracy and thus have limited abilities to seek education, engage in healthcare, find and use online information, find and keep a job, and engage with family, friends, and the community. This research argues that improving adult digital literacy confronts adults' issues of exclusion and marginalization that accompany the increasing importance of digitally mediated activities in modern and social life. And finally, this work comes from the belief that being able to hear all voices enriches society at large, and that no one should be marginalized in these efforts. As we think about how this focused population interacts with learning materials and tutors, we have found it useful to turn to the language socialization model of second language acquisition as a way to understand the experiences of these learners. And I approach this data from the theoretical stance that language and knowledge are learned in and through interactions, and that sociolinguistic routines become part of language learners' communicative repertoires. I also view learning as a social phenomenon, thus the unit of analysis in this study is the group and the community rather than looking at individual cognition. So this work is grounded in literature on digital inequality, digital literacy, language learning, language socialization, and online affinity groups. The research I'm describing today is part of a larger multi-year, multi-state service project and research project. And the service project involved multi-state support systems for broadband adoption by vulnerable adults. The project lead was Portland State University, and the program was implemented by 6 partners in geographically dispersed locations across the United States. The Learner Web was the delivery platform for the materials, and it focused on a geographic area and programs that included adult education programs, employment and training programs, colleges and community colleges, K-12 schools, public libraries, social service agencies, public housing agencies, faith-based organizations. And just to give you a sense of the scope, the project included tutors who logged about 50,000 hours, and there were over 12,000 learners, of whom 2,000 identified Spanish as their preferred language. So in thinking about this work, the research project focused on the implementation of the service project and specifically examined the digital literacy acquisition process among these language learners in this environment. The goal of this work is to be able to make recommendations for implementation for adult vulnerable learners, those who have less access to some services, and to describe what their learning looked like in a variety of settings so that we can think about learning principles and learning aims. So although this entire project was much bigger than what I'm going to be focusing on today I really want to talk about the role of language in the digital literacy acquisition process. The learning model used in this study provides adult learners with features designed to support their goal-oriented learning. Learners and tutors came together in open access computer labs within the community to engage, discuss, and explore computers and the internet, really focusing on their acquisition of digital literacy that could help them in getting a job and in supporting their daily interactions with civic organizations and with their own friends and family group. The Learner Web was the online learning platform that provided access to instructional content that included video, reading, interactive practice activities across the web. It scaffolded and organized resources towards specific learner-centered goals and provided a series of self-check quizzes to help learners reflect on the content they learned as they moved across the materials at their own pace. So thus far, I've provided you with the context within which this research and this particular analysis occurred. And I'll be shifting now specifically to talking about the salient role of language within this process. The research questions that were addressed included how do Spanish and bilingual learners and tutors interact with digital learning materials, and what factors influence their choices. The data corpus included interview transcripts from 28 learners, 29 tutors, and focused on 5 case studies. The researchers also interviewed 14 key stakeholders who were focused on program development, and the analysis I'm discussing today was focused on the Spanish-speaking and bilingual tutors and learners. So in collecting lab observations, interview data, and looking at learner profiles, we conducted a grounded theory analysis in which we first created and refined our coding scheme and then iteratively coded all of our transcripts. During this iterative process, we met regularly as a research team to compare and discuss codes to ensure inter-rater reliability. And after mapping the territory that we focused on across all of these different interviews, we identified categories and themes and began our grounded theory of self-paced, tutor-facilitated digital literacy acquisition. So 3 main themes emerged in this research: how the learner moves through the digital literacy acquisition process, how programs are embedded and connected to the larger community, and what we're focusing today in this presentation, in this talk, is the role of language. So I'm not going to spend much time on this particular graphic, but I think it's important to frame this language piece within the learning path that the learners in this study experienced. We found that adult learners moved through 3 basic phases as they were learning digital literacy: entry, program interaction, and skills integration and impact. And as these learners were developing digital literacy skills, they experienced 3 pivotal moments in their learning: overcoming fear, I can do it; gaining confidence, I'm not going to break it; and seeing relevance, this is important to me. At this point, I'm going to move into the findings on the role of language. Given our research questions asked, which focused on learning digital literacy content offered in 2 languages, we thought about how do Spanish and bilingual learners and tutors interact with digital literacy learning materials, and what factors influence their choices. Although there were similarities in the experiences of English-dominant learners and the Spanish or bilingual learners, examining the experiences of individuals who identified Spanish as their primary language allowed us to see qualitative differences in their experience. Analysis indicated that the learners interacted with tutors and the online system, and all of those interactions were based on these 6 factors. Looking at the data through the lens of Spanish-dominant speakers also allowed us to identify tensions between what tutors saw as the needs of learners and how the learners themselves understood their own needs and positioned themselves as learners. In the next few slides, I'm going to unpack the 6 factors that I showed you on the previous slide and then move into some implications and conclusions. We found that tutors had clear biases and preferences for how they wanted to interact with the learning materials and with the tutees they were mentoring. Some tutors indicated that the primary purpose of the digital literacy program was what should drive the day, not language choices. And so they were trying to be clear and simple so as not to overload cognitively the language learning and didn't feel that language learning should be added to the task. And others wanted to stay, other tutors wanted learners to stay within their L1 in order to provide clarity of meaning. However, some tutors were much, much more flexible and used language switching within the functions of the program to allow learners to access the materials they needed in the language the tutor thought was most useful. Tutors, however, also acknowledged that their exposure to English, and especially the English of the internet, was important because of the predominance of English language online. So as tutors pointed out, there were certain words on the internet that individuals needed to know, and others suggested that people needed to have that cognitive flexibility and use the internet language in both contexts. Another finding that emerged was that even though Spanish may have been the learners' first language, a number of these Spanish-dominant learners opted to use the program in English because of dialect differences. So as one learner told us, when it's in another language, I get lost because some of the words don't mean the same to me. In English, it's easier for me to understand. We also found that the learner's L1, L2 proficiency was important, but levels of proficiency were very complex. For instance, this learner had been in the United States for 40 years, but never attended school in the United States. She was highly aware of her language skills and in some ways held a deficit view of her own abilities. In essence, she communicated functionally in 3 languages, and her language choice changed depending on the context of use. When it came to using the learning materials for digital literacy, she shifted into English because she was more comfortable in English learning and also better related to the English register. This learner knew Spanish, but not academic Spanish, so she felt less able to use the Spanish material to further her digital literacy aims. A tutor provided us with some insights into this phenomenon and how she responded. This particular learning environment was linked to a community ESL program, and that program used testing to determine student placement. The tutors adjusted what materials they used with learners based on what they knew of the learner's language skills, but then they also made adjustments depending on the quality of the Spanish translation in the learning materials. So despite tutor preferences and biases to choose a certain language and stick with that same language throughout the digital literacy learning experience, the learners in a lot of ways pushed back on what they wanted. For example, this learner told us about how she used the language switching function embedded in the learning materials to support her own learning. She moved through the lessons twice, and once in each language, and this process supported her learning of the material, but also, in her words, bolstered her language skills. The learner's flexibility in moving between languages was related to their desire to learn English, and again, the learners would assert themselves to focus on certain aspects in certain ways. So as we considered 6 factors in our analysis identified in our data regarding how tutors and learners interacted with the online digital literacy learning materials, we focused on the idea that language variation could be used as a resource rather than a problem to be solved. Tutors and their enthusiasm to provide a highly supportive learning environment did not always provide opportunities for learners to act autonomously. And so we really felt that andragogical trait of self-determination was in some ways under-realized in our study. However, we saw that learners, whether they came in with an intrinsic sense of who they were as a learner or as they developed it through positive learning experiences, would act more autonomously as they became more comfortable. And this perspective creates a learning context that allows us to promote the idea of language flexibility. As one of the tutors said, it's just differences. You got to find out what makes them comfortable. So rather than seeing language variation as the problem, we have come to understand that it's the lack of resources in a dual language format that could be the problem. Based on this analysis, as well as our larger study and previous research, we argue that programs are needed that support learner autonomy and self-determination and increase accessibility to the needed resources that can be offered in multiple language formats. As a direct outcome of this research was that the Learner Web team, led by Kathy Harris, who developed these materials, have worked to increase accessibility by continuing to offer material in multiple modes, adding text-to-speech capabilities, hearing spoken language fluently through videos, and adding an ESL or simplified English version of these digital literacy learning plans. We also suggest that there are implications for future research. We asked to what extent is these findings generalizable to other language groups, to those from cultures with few language resources on the internet, but not just culture, the availability and accessibility of these resources. And we need to further consider the role of dialect, register, and culture in people's use of online learning materials. We also need to consider the sometimes tensioned relationships between tutors and learners as they negotiate what the learner needs to be self-determining and autonomous, and what the tutor believes are good teaching and a supportive environment. So moving into implications for the field, as mentioned, there is a need to customize learning approaches that meet the needs of Spanish-dominant and bilingual learners throughout all kinds of learning materials, and to make language choice a notable feature of how individuals are tutored, how any learning environment is constructed. And these supports need to recognize nuances in language and literacy skills. Furthermore, programs need to make decisions on how to coach tutors working within a context of language variety. This is consistent with our stance that program administrators and policymakers should work toward the concept of digital equity by resisting the deficit model of the learner, and rather than trying to change the learner, take them from where they need to be to where we'd like them to be, using language as a resource. Thank you so much for your time and interest in this study, and I look forward to further interactions with you. Thank you.